Welcome to week 3 of Brush Lettering and Watercolor with Jess Park. Today we'll be going over the basics of painting botanicals such as stems and leaves, flowers, cacti, and succulents. Let's start by going over the supplies that you'll need for today. The first is watercolor paper. I'm going to be using this 400 series pad, but you're welcome to use the Strathmore Watercolor Art Journal or the 400 series block. Next, you'll need watercolor paint. You can use the paint that comes in a tube or a pan. We'll also be using assorted sizes of round brushes. For example, a size 16, a size 10, and a size 0. You'll also need water and a container to hold it in, a paper towel or a rag, a fine tip black pen such as the Sakura Pigma micron, and optional will be gouache. Gouache is a water-based paint, and we'll be using it to add some details to our botanicals today. As always, the first thing you want to do is wet your paint. We'll be starting with painting some stems and leaves. You can see in your instructional sheet that I've included some examples, and we'll paint some of those today. The style that we're painting in today is called loose watercolor. This means that we're not really interested in painting every little detail, but rather we want to get the overall movement and the color and the overall shape of each piece that we're painting here. So let's go ahead and start with some stems and leaves. So what I've done so far is just wet my brush, and I'm going to go ahead and start with the size 10 brush. Now remember we talked about last week where you use the very tip of your brush to get fine details, and then you press down to get broader strokes. So when painting a stem, you're going to be using more of the tip of your brush, and it's going to be angled upright, something like this. So when painting a stem, I don't necessarily draw a super straight line, because when you look in nature you don't really see stems and sticks that are completely straight. So I like to give it a little bit of a curve, and I like to make it thick in the bottom, and as I move towards the leaves I release pressure on my brush to get a thinner stroke. So let's go ahead and try that. Okay, and then from here I'm going to go ahead and add some leaves. So let's say we're going to have one leaf coming out here, another one here. Let's put one next to it. And you can kind of vary the angles, because again, in nature we see a lot of variation, and that's kind of what brings interest to a piece. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is paint a leaf. So I'm just going to get some green paint here. Alright, so let's start with our leaf down here. What I'm going to do is, you can watch and then I'll explain. Okay, so that's my first leaf. So what I basically did was I pushed down, and then as I got to the tip of the leaf I released pressure, and then the same thing, I applied pressure, and as I got to the tip of the leaf I released pressure. And I like to leave a little space here just to remind us that there is like a vein that's going across the middle of that leaf. So now let's try something with more jagged edges, such as this one right over here. So again, I'm going to start by painting the stem of the leaf. And you see as I go towards the end, it gets a little thinner. So the way you draw that leaf is you draw it, or paint it, is you paint it just like how you did the previous ones, where you full pressure, and then as you get to the tip of the leaf, you release pressure. Now you want to make sure there's enough water on your brush so you can make those jagged edges. And the way I do that is I just go to the tip and I draw out some of the paint in these quick strokes. You have to make sure that your paint is still wet, because once it dries, it'll leave a hard edge and you won't get the same jagged effect. Okay, so that's one side. And then I'm going to leave that very thin space and then do the other side. So here we go. And I like to make it kind of meet at the end. And you'll notice that I paint these leaves pretty quickly. And that's kind of just like the style of this painting, this loose painting, where you don't want to touch it too much. All right, so I think I'm pretty happy with that. Now let's paint something that has more of like a very thin leaf. So it's just going to be a very thin and tall leaf. So again, when you're doing your stem, your brush is upright, thicker with more pressure, and then as you move up, you release. And I think that giving it a little curve adds more movement and makes it look a little more interesting. So full pressure, and then as I move up, I release pressure. And I got a little space there, but I like it, so I'm just going to leave it there. And then we'll do the other side. So full pressure and just let it meet. So there's another leaf. On to some flowers. Okay, so the first one is just like a bud. Okay, so the way you do that is, I'm just going to show you. So in the shape of a bud here, so let's say that this is one petal and on the other side I've got something else. So then I'm going to just leave the slightest bit of space just to show that there's some kind of separation there. Otherwise it kind of looks like a blob. And we're going to let that dry just a little bit, because if I add the leaves now and it touches, it just becomes a blob. So I want this paint to be where I can still tell my paper is shiny, but it's not pooled the way that it is there. So while that dries, let's move on to the next one, which has three petals. So for 3, I'm going to do one petal here, and then I'm going to add another one, and I'm leaving some space there just to give it some interest. And then I'm going to tilt my paper just a little so I can do the third. Maybe to make this one a little fatter. Right, so there's a 3, and again, I want to add some color in the center here, but I want it to dry just a little bit. Okay, so for the next flower, I want to demonstrate that you can change your flower up just by, changing up the length of your petals or the thickness of it. So these are a little longer and more teardrop shape, but maybe I want something like rounder petals. That's one. Okay, so there's 4 petals there. And maybe we'll do one from it. So these have all been like from a, I guess, a view where you're just looking straight on. But in order to make a flower look like it's kind of at an angle, you play with the length of the flower petals. One here. So these are the back petals. And these, I want them to look like they're more coming towards me. So I'm going to make them shorter. And you can already see that this one is much shorter than the one back here. So these look like they're closer and those look like they're further away. So we're going to add some detail. Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm just getting some black. And I used a little less water on these petals, so they dried a little more quickly than these. I'm just going to go ahead and add some little dots in the middle here. And you can add them wherever you like. This one here, I'm going to add a yellow center. And let's give it a leaf too while we're at it. So get some green and maybe have a leaf coming out this way. So remember we talked about drawing the stem first. And then let's add some leaves to our bud here. And I'm going to get very close without getting too into the flower. You can touch it more if you like, but I just wanted the slightest bit of blending here. And then maybe a stem that comes down this way. Maybe I'll add some yellow to that purple. So what I'm trying to show you here is, I mean, these aren't actual flowers that I'm thinking of as I'm painting. And so you can always, I guess, take some artistic liberties and do kind of your own thing, create your own flowers. And by varying the shapes of the petals and by varying the colors, you create variations. Now let's paint a rose. So I've mixed some pink here. And I'm back to my number 10 brush. So we're going to go ahead and start with the center of the rose. And again, we do this really quickly because this is a loose style. We're not focused on every petal and every detail. So I start with the very center of the rose. And I kind of draw or paint two interlocking C's. So kind of like this, but on a very small scale. And then what I do is I'm going to go ahead and paint some more concentric half circles around that. You can leave a little white space in places, and you can touch the previous petals in other spaces. Okay, and then as you go out, you want it to get a little lighter, so you can rinse your brush off. And you also want to start adding more pressure to get those bigger, fuller looking petals. I guess I had some green on my paper there. That's okay. Now you can stop here, or you can keep going, make it a fuller rose. But I like to also, at the very end, take some paint and then just dab it, just to show that it's kind of darker in the middle here. So that's a rose. So let's do one more together. Maybe I'll make it slightly different color here. Maybe here's one that's a completely side view, just to give you a better idea. And a little stem here. And rose petals have that jagged edge that we kind of did earlier. So you see that this style, you paint very quickly. Alright, and there's some roses. The last thing we're going to do today is paint some cactus and succulents. So I'm just going to mix some green, and I'm back to my size 16. Now with the cactus, I like to use a very quick, all of them have been pretty quick, but I like to paint it very quickly, and it gives me like a dry brush effect. Okay, so I've loaded my paintbrush, and what you're going to do is draw a tall U shape. Okay, and then I'm just going to fill it in, and that's it. Very fast, and maybe if I want something like some shade to it, then I can go back and add a little. But I don't want to touch it too much. I like this texture here. And then maybe there's a little growth coming here, so. And that's it. Now while that's still wet, if you want a flower coming off the top, then go ahead and grab a smaller size paintbrush, like a size 10. And while it's still slightly damp, just quick down strokes. If you want it to blend, you can bring it towards the edge. And then, okay, so you can see I have my darker side here, and then as it moves towards that side, it gets a little lighter, and I get those dry brush strokes, and that tells me kind of where the light is coming from. Maybe there's a little shadow here, so I'll go back and add some details now. Now if you do this and add the details while it's still wet or too wet, you can see what happens is you just kind of lose that detail. So you want to make sure it's slightly dry. So you want to make sure that it's dry. Okay. And let's do another one. So what I'm going to do is draw the sections. Okay. So that's one section. And then I'm going to leave a white space here. And draw the next section of it. And the last one on this side. Okay. And maybe this side again is darker because of maybe the sun's coming from the right. Like the flower drawings, I like to touch it as little as possible, just to keep that clean look where it doesn't look overworked. And while that's still slightly damp, let's add a little flower on top. So this time let's do an orange flower. Maybe I want it to be a little red on the tip of that. Add a little red on top. And while that is going, let's draw that fire stick. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to start with green. I'm going to draw the stem. I'm going to draw little stems coming off of it here. Make it a little thicker. Now while your paint is still wet, you can always go over it. Once it dries and you go over it, it doesn't always look the best. Okay, so there's my base. So the next color is going to be yellow, so just grab some yellow on your brush. And I'm going to go ahead and go from top down, so it's going to meet the green. Top, down, and just barely touch the green. You want to vary the heights. Okay, maybe make a little one coming off of there. And let gravity kind of do its thing if it's not blending. Okay, so then the next color is like a orangey yellow. So this time I'm going to go in like this. Now if your paint dried like mine did on this one, it's not going to blend, but that's okay. So you want to move quickly so that everything could blend. Okay. And at the very tip, I want some red. All right. And there is a fire stick. My cactus is now dry enough that I can add some details to it. So you can add details a few different ways. You can use the black pen, or you can use gouache. So I'm going to go ahead and use a black pen for this top one here. And I'm just adding the little prickly needles of the cactus. And the way I do that is I'm just adding little lines here. And you can add some to the edges. And they're kind of all in a row, so I like to kind of stick them in a line vertically. And then to vary it, some of them I'll make them a little longer. And that makes that look a little more natural. So some have 3, some have 2. Okay. And you can continue that throughout the rest of your cactus. Finish that. You can see it just adds a different, some detail to your cactus. Okay, so that's one way, and then I'm going to show you another way, and we're going to do that on this one here. So I'm going to use some gouache and a size 0. So gouache is a water-based paint. You can use it kind of like watercolor, but when you don't add very much water to it, it kind of acts a little more like acrylic paint. So you can layer on top of your watercolor, but make sure it's dry. And I'm going to go ahead and add little details. And I've just got it in a little container like this. I've just poured it and mixed in the colors that I liked. So this is a mixture of some orange and some yellow and white. Now you can use this to add detail to your flowers, like if you want to add the little stamen on your flowers. And it just like, it kind of pops against a background like this. Okay, that's it. It's a great work today. Next week we're going to go ahead and put it all together. So we'll be combining brush lettering and watercolor. I'm going to be introducing different projects that you can do that combine the two techniques. So go ahead and practice your brush lettering and practice painting. You have some examples in your instructional sheets, so you can go ahead and try those out. And I will see you guys next week. Bye.